Hello there. Welcome back to the Collapse Life podcast. I'm Zahra Sethna, your host. And today's episode comes to you from the high desert of far west Texas, where I'm visiting for a couple of days. One of the things that we talk about here on this podcast is how our personal freedoms are either being slowly eroded or outright stolen. And on that front, a new threat has emerged, especially to rural communities like this one, in the form of so called natural asset companies. Our guest today is Margaret Byfield. She's the executive director of American Stewards of Liberty. And she's here to help us understand what natural asset companies are and why they're such a threat. She's a national speaker, writer, and commentator on natural resource issues, and we're thrilled to welcome her to the virtual Collapse Life studio. Margaret, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Zara. Thanks for having me on. And thanks for covering this issue. It's pretty critical.
It is critical, and it's another one of these somewhat complex topics that I think very often they are sort of think it's so complex that it'll go over our heads. So that's why I think it's really important to have you help us understand it, because this is actually one of perhaps the scarier instruments that has been proposed recently. It would actually allow private interests to purchase mineral rich areas and actually stop productive and economic activities on that land. So if you could just start with a brief overview and correct me if I'm wrong in that assessment, tell us what natural asset companies are and how they would operate.
Well, the natural asset companies were a proposal that was brought forward by a group called Intrinsic Exchange Group. And that group is funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. That's who funded them. But what they did was they partnered with the New York Stock Exchange to create this new investment vehicle. And what this vehicle would do is it would allow people to enroll something called ecosystem services, which is a combination of natural processes. So if you think about a piece of land, what would be enrolled in these companies are things like the value of pollination and photosynthesis and these kind of these kind of things. They would basically be creating a value out of whole cloth. In other words, out of thin air, coming up with the value for these things and creating it as an asset for individuals to profit off of. Now, they sell this as a way to kind of help conserve land and, to help nature by creating a different way that we can help, support nature. It's a huge environmental push, but it's pretty nefarious. What they were attempting to do was very dangerous for America. And let me back up a little bit and explain the 30 by 30 agenda so that people kind of have the full picture of what was going to happen. But when Biden was elected, 6 days into his office, he initiated this campaign called 30 by 30. Now, our organization, we're a property rights organization, and we track these things. And we knew that the environmentalists would be pushing this campaign. So what 30 by 30 is 30 by 30 is an international agenda. It's been initiated in other countries to permanently protect 30% of the world's lands and oceans by 2030. Okay, they want to lock out the people eventually, not all at once. They couldn't get it done if they told people that. So it's an eventual, move in that direction to permanently protect this land off limits to human use. Mm-hmm. And if you've been tracking anything going on in the Netherlands or in the European Union, where the Minister of Nitrogen has come in and told the landowners that 2,000 to 3,000 of the landowners must voluntarily sell their land to the federal government. Well, that's because they have been under a program called Natura 2000 since about 2000, which is basically 30 by 30. It's the 30 by 30 equivalent of what Biden has initiated in America. So what the Biden administration did, they initiated this by executive order. They don't have congressional authority or constitutional authority to do this, but they have retooled, repurposed, refocused all of the administrative agencies to work towards this goal. So all the grant funding is going towards creating more protected areas that then, of course, the federal government has more control over. And so ever since he's been in office, we've seen this push for more lands to go into protected status, which basically means they're either controlled by or owned by environmental nonprofit land trusts or the federal government. And so, as they have been pushing more acreage into this protected status, that then is what would have been enrolled in these natural asset companies. Okay, so they're taking the land away from the Americans, and then they created a way to figure out how they can profit from these protected lands as they're taking them away from us. And so that's really the purpose of the natural asset companies, was to create a way that the world elites could then profit off of our protected lands. So the two agendas go hand in hand, and you kind of have to understand them both to understand, okay, now natural asset companies are starting to make sense.
Yeah.
Because the same people who have been behind the 30 by 30 agenda are the same people behind the climate crisis narrative. I mean, you know all the names. They are also the ones that were behind creating the natural asset companies. And so they, on the one hand, they're pushing to get more land under protected status. On the other hand, they're positioning so that they're the ones who will profit off of that when it's taken out of the hands of the American people.
It is shocking, and it seems contradictory. So protect is such a nice word, right? We're protecting this land, but essentially it means that it's taken out of the hands of private property owners and therefore taken out of productive use. Is that correct? But then somehow
Yeah.
they profit. How would they profit off of an unproductive land?
Yeah, so one of the requirements of any of the land going into a natural asset company or a NAC, we started calling them NACs for short,
Yeah.
is that the land enrolled had to be sustainably managed, and there could be no uses of the land that were not replenishable. So immediately that eliminated oil and gas and mineral development. Those things were not going to happen on these lands.
Uh-huh.
And the purpose was to grow the ecosystem services. Okay, not so you have to really think about this kind of backwards. If you have a piece of land right now that is covered in forest, well, the product that comes off of that is sold and contributes to the economy is the timber and therefore the construction materials. And then the consumers determine the price of that, our buy and sell market. So you and I as consumers, we really set the price on what the value of that timber is. This would be completely different. If you took that same piece of land now, if it was enrolled in the NAC, then what the value, the profit that they said was going to come off of these would be the carbon, the carbon sequestration, the clean air. And instead of having consumers determine what the value of that is, now you would have a group of bureaucrats using a UN accounting system method of statistics to determine that the air you breathe is worth X and the air I breathe is worth Y.
Wow.
And so you have this manipulation of the market. So there's a couple of things going on here. They were actually creating new property rights. By things that nobody has ever owned before, nor should anybody own, because they don't qualify as property. They're not something that you can exclude others from. How do you exclude somebody from benefiting from pollination or photosynthesis? You can't do that. So they don't qualify. And also it's something you can't contain. So, water is a property right, but you can contain water. Land is a property right, but you can contain it. You can't contain pollination or carbon sequestration or any of these different things that they're trying to quantify.
Yeah.
So they literally were creating a new property right and claiming ownership of that by the enrollment of these lands into the natural asset companies.
Was the idea that it would be voluntary, or was there a fear that landowners would be compelled or coerced to put their land into NACs?
Well, it really would have been both, because it is voluntary, but the rule said that the federal government could enroll in their lands in the NACs. So now we have, and actually Exhibit 3 of the rules said the national parks could be enrolled in these NACs. So now Yellowstone National Park can be enrolled in one of these NACs, and the world elites like BlackRock and China Sovereign Wealth Funds, different entities, State Street, can now be profiting off of these protected lands, our national parks. So that was one thing. The actual land and those ecosystem services could be enrolled in these voluntarily by the federal government. They can enroll them. The other thing, though, is private landowners that have a conservation easement in perpetuity on their lands. A conservation easement is a device that environmentalists have really started pushing. I mean, they've been pushing it for a while, but they've really kind of upped their pressure on landowners, because what the landowner does is they sell the development right to the land trust in perpetuity, and that development right is usually the most valuable piece of the land. But now
Yeah.
the land trust owns that in perpetuity. And so that's a separate right. You can go to the Nature Conservancy's 990 balance sheet, and you'll see that there's a line item in there on how much they own in conservation easements worldwide, and it's stunning. Well, that value, that's a separate value. That value could have been enrolled in these natural asset companies
Well,
with or without the landowner's consent. So now you have a landowner who is saddled with all the restrictions of signing that conservation easement. So they're the only ones that can't use their land. The contract that they sign says, how many homes they could ever build in the future in perpetuity. Think in terms of 50 years, 100 years, 500 years from now. That's been decided. Our generation is deciding what future generations can do on the land, which is a moral issue, which we also struggle with.
yeah.
But the landowner is the one restricted. The land trust controls that property because now everything has to be controlled by the conservation purpose or comply with the conservation purpose, which the land trust controls. And so the agreement changes the relationship between the landowner and the land. People say that when they sign a conservation easement, it's private property, but it is before they sign it. But once they sign it, it's no longer private property because they have sole control of that land to the land trust. Well, that became really clear in the NAC fight when landowners realized that the land trust could enroll their land in these natural asset companies, the conservation easement, profit from that with or without the landowner's consent.
Yeah.
So
Well,
it kind of goes both ways, but it's one of these things too. What we've seen with the Biden administration is they're really putting a lot of pressure on landowners to sign up for these conservation programs, enroll in conservation easements. They're throwing tons of money at them. And when you get into an area that already has a lot of protected lands, that pressure is increased on them because they're trying to create big ecosystem reserves and connected areas. So you just see them kind of expanding out what they are trying to control.
um, we've been talking about these NACs in the past tense. I think it's important maybe to explain kind of where we are in the process with this proposal and what might happen next.
Yeah, so we've been tracking this issue since September of 2021, and it's been on our radar along with 30 by 30. So the different things that have happened along the way, we've been watching pretty closely and had a number of things ready and some key people kind of up to speed on this issue when on October 4th of 2023, the Securities Exchange Commission issued a proposed rule to authorize these NACs. So here's the process that had to take place. This is such a unique investment vehicle. I mean, it kind of defies all accounting principles, American accounting principles, and understanding of property rights and all these different things, that the New York Stock Exchange had to make an application to the SEC in order to get approval to list these on the New York Stock Exchange. So that forced the SEC to issue a rule whether to approve or disapprove. Well, they issued a rule to approve these. They allowed 21 days of public comment, which is a very, very short window,
Mhm.
especially for something this massive. When they did it, there was no press release. It was very quiet. We fortunately were able, learn that it had been filed and were able to jump on it. But I mean, nobody in the business world knew about it. Nobody on the Hill knew about this. And that was deliberate. They were trying to
Good.
sneak this one through. So immediately, of course, we started reaching out to our contacts. We're very blessed to have been introduced to the right people who could move mountains And we got a lot of people educated and brought up to speed on this. Treasurer Marla Oaks did an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal very quickly. And that was the first to really bring it to the business community's attention. They were planning, their rule was to authorize these on November 18th of 2023 in
Wow.
45 days from issuing that rule. So we had like zero time to get, the opposition educated and up to speed on this. We managed to secure the first delay, and so it was pushed to January 2nd, and that allowed us to bring on a whole other group of people. Senator Ricketts is from Nebraska. It's one of our heroes on this. He issued the first letter on this coming from the Senate. And we worked closely with him on 30 by 30. So we actually went in and talked to him about this issue prior to the SEC rules. So he was already up to speed and could act quickly. Representative Harriet Hagman from Wyoming, she really led the charge in the House. She was phenomenal. And then, of course, Bruce Westerman initiated the oversight of this proposed rule in the House Resources Committee, which was incredibly important that an investigation begin into this rule. So a lot of things happened. 25 state attorney generals came out with a very piercing letter showing the illegality of what they were trying to do, and it was very powerful letter, basically signaling that they were ready to sue the SEC if they went forward on this. And so, with all of these key things happening, the New York Stock Exchange made the decision to withdraw their application, and they did that on January 17th. And so, I mean, it was a Herculean effort to get that done, because they have, Rockefeller Foundation, New York Stock Exchange. I mean, the whole climate crisis cartel is behind this. And so you're literally fighting the biggest, wealthiest, most powerful people in the world when we took on the NACs.
Yeah.
But, fortunately, and with God's hand, absolutely all over this, leading this. And I could tell you stories. I mean, this is something that my husband and I knew as we were in the middle of this, that we were not leading this charge, that he was opening the right doors at the right time. And it was phenomenal to be a part of that. But this is absolutely his victory. And it certainly reassured my husband and I that if anybody out there thinks that God has given up on our country, I tell you, absolutely not. He is fighting key battles for us. That's pretty incredible. So NACs were stopped. Yeah. NACs were stopped, which is really good. But, what's so important about you bringing this issue up is that we know this is a temporary win. They never go away. And that's why when you reached out, I was very thankful, because we need to remain vigilant on this. And there is a lot more ahead of what they can do, and which they already have in works, that is pretty scary.
Yeah. And I was going to ask you that. I mean, these things never go away. They know to back off a little bit, and they usually will kind of come back with some new name, some new concept, similar but not quite the same. So what's your assessment of kind of where we stand? And do you think NACs will come back as they are, or will they get a rebrand like ESG and DEI have done?
Yeah, so the Intrinsic Exchange Commission, or group, immediately after this was withdrawn, they had press releases out, they had conversations talking about how this whole proposal was just misunderstood. And, groups like ours were just radically misstated what they were trying to do, of course. So, we always expect that, but that's going to be their position. And they signaled that these would be back. So we know they're going to try through a different tack. Since then, we've seen some major articles coming out, talking about the good thing that these NACs would have done, like in the New York Times. So they're paying somebody a lot of money to do some good PR for them. So there's going to be a lot of money, and we've just seen some interesting articles come out. So we know it's coming back. They're setting the stage to try and get the narrative right this time, so that they can actually get something like this through. So we have to remain vigilant on it. There is another component of this, though, that we ought to talk about. But before we move off on NACs, let me just tell you one more thing that I think is important for listeners to understand about what NACs would have done. One of the things that the rule did was give management authority to the investors over the resources that were enrolled in the NACs. They also said and invited in Exhibit 5, they invited foreign interests to invest in NACs.
Wow.
So between those two things, now you could have had, let's say a NAC was created that Yellowstone National Park was enrolled in. China's sovereign wealth funds could have become the primary investor in that, and therefore would have had management authority over Yellowstone National Park. This is one of the reasons why this issue really scared people concerned about national security. And as one interviewer that interviewed very early on in the middle of this fight said, this was the equivalent, Bill Walton, the equivalent of bringing America to its knees without a fight, because it would have given China control over our major resources, prevented us from using it, or them coming in and figuring out how they would eventually use it. And there is a path for that. And we probably don't need to get into the weeds on that, but that's just a really key point that I think your audience needs to understand how close we came to really losing control of this country to our enemies.
Yeah.
Through this NAC approach.
Through an investment vehicle. I mean, of all things, you'd literally be selling someone the keys to your home. I mean, it's
yes. Yeah, it was just, and this is why this is important too, and I'm glad you're making me think about all these things. But Chairman Green, who is chairman of the Homeland Security, he has filed a bill to stop NACs and anything that looks like this, like a NAC, anytime in the future. Chair of Homeland Security, because he understood how detrimental this would have been to our Homeland Security. So that bill is in there. That's something that if your audience would, like to look into, they should, and see if their representative is on as a co-signer. They should be on that, and they can make that call to him. That would be great.
Amazing.
But but in tandem with this, at the same time, the federal government has been pursuing this same idea and entrenching it in the federal government. So let me back up a little bit. In January of 2023, the White House released a national strategy to create what they are calling natural capital accounts, to create a line item on the federal balance sheet called natural capital accounts, in which they would record the value of these natural processes that we were talking about earlier: pollination, photosynthesis, and of course, we knew they would obviously record the federal lands and those natural processes, however they value those, to put them on the federal balance sheet to inflate our collateral base so that they can continue to rack up more debt. So, our debt, our national debt, is owed to other countries, including companies whom are our enemies. And we have a limited number of assets that's collateral. That debt is collateralized. And what we have been watching is we've seen, as our national debt has gone up, we have seen the federal government increase its land holdings. So as it continues to spend more and outpace its collateral base, we have agendas like 30 by 30 come on board, where we're told as Americans, we must conserve, restore, and protect more lands to save nature. Well, that's the ruse. It's not about that. It's about increasing the collateral base so that they can continue to spend more and get Americans more in debt through our national debt. So that's what this is about. Well, they're getting to a place where they're racking up so much debt that they're having to actually create new assets. So what they're trying to do now is put the value of these newly created, first ever monetized assets like pollination and photosynthesis on the federal balance sheet through these natural capital accounts. So that they initiated formally January of 2023. So that's the tandem issue we've been watching along with NACs.
Right.
And April of 2022, they issued a press release where they talked about how they had been working on 4 test pilot accounts so that they could figure out the methodology to determine how they would value these to put these natural processes and put them on the federal balance sheet. And so they do have one of these accounts is the land test account. And in that, it's really interesting. The press release talks about how there's 2.45 billion acres in America. So they're talking about the physical land, not really the natural processes so much, but the physical land. And it's interesting what they said and what they didn't say in that narrative. They said that $32 trillion comes of that value is from private land. And then they say it would be an omission not to include these on the federal balance sheet. So they didn't, in this statement, they didn't say, and the federal government owns X amount of that, that $2.45 billion, which is worth X trillion dollars. That's not what they said. What they did was they valued the private land, and then their next statement is this needs to go on the federal balance sheet. So what that says is that every individual in America, if you have a home, if you have a yard, if you have a lot, the federal government looks at that as its asset to put on the natural balance sheet to be collateral for the national debt. This is the first time in history this has been done. So it's pretty frightening.
It is very frightening. Is that already an official process, or is that something that is still being proposed?
Well, no, the White House has made it official. They
Wow.
are going forward with this, and they are entrenching it, putting these policies through 27 federal agencies. So it is getting entrenched in our federal government. It's all been done by just executive power. It's not anything that Congress has approved or Congress has directed that they do. This is all unilaterally being done by the Biden administration. And so, not with the permission of the people, not with the permission or the vote of Congress, our representatives, but they are just unilaterally deciding that Americans' private property needs to go on the federal balance sheet to help secure the national debt. And for other reasons. It creates a new way to tax the American people. Now, if we can be taxed on the pollination or the photosynthesis um, or docked for the carbon that comes off of our land, then our taxes may increase. They found a new way to tax us. There's a
Yeah.
lot of different ways that this can play out.
Well, also, if they're separating the process, so you own the private property, but the processes that take place on your property are not your own, then there's a new way of shutting down or controlling those processes. So you may own the land, but XYZ, you're not allowed to do these things because of the processes, and we have control over the photosynthesis that takes place on your patch of backyard. I mean, it's shocking and is there any kind of a constitutional protection or avenue that we can go down there that this is just exceeding the authority of the federal government?
Yeah, I think at some point we're going to have to do that. And it's going to have to be, though, once, well, you've got to create standing. You've got to create, you've got to have standing, you've got to have harm to really make that kind of a claim. And so we're going to have to see this kind of play out a little bit more until we get to that point where we can establish those things and that can be challenged. But, and there may be other ways, that constitutional attorneys could find a way to get at this. But right now, because it's all done administratively, it's utilizing existing programs that are already authorized and just kind of weaving it into that. It makes it very, very slippery, very hard to figure out how you attack it through the court system. And so, obviously, a very simple fix would be if we get a new administration that opposes this idea, that they rescind all of this.
Mhm.
It went in by presidential fiat, so take it out the same way. I say that on the surface, it sounds really easy. It won't be because it's been entrenched into 28 federal or 27 federal agencies.
Well,
But that's the first thing to do is get this stopped at the executive level to where it's no longer continued. And then I think the second part of that is Congress does need to step in and weigh in and decide, is this something that the executive branch should have the authority to do? And if they shouldn't, make that explicit that they don't have that authority.
It's one of these issues too where it's wrapped up in government regulation, but it's also handing over to private enterprise. It's a sort of public-private partnership, the three words that send shivers up our spine here in Collapse Life. But there's an argument being made that this is a good free market alternative to having the government regulate these natural processes. So, um, help us unpack that kind of argument or push back on that. What would you say?
Yeah, I find that one kind of laughable. So one of the reasons that we've heard that argument being pushed is a lot of the industries. Well, we see it. Such a big push to be sustainable, to sell sustainable products, and airlines, want to reduce their carbon footprint. So how they do that is they have to basically offset their carbon footprint by purchasing a piece of land and setting it aside so that it has no carbon footprint. And
Mhm.
therefore that mitigates or offsets that. So they can say, hey, we are net zero, right? Well, that whole process. So you have industry that's basically been pushed into this way of thinking, and it's been coerced. It's been a social agenda that has got them there, not market forces, but a social agenda. And when you really unpack that, it's basically blackmail. And so, what I think I find interesting is the people who are saying, "Oh, but this is just part of the free market, and shouldn't the free market just, play here?" And my response is, well, you know, blackmail is still blackmail, whether they're using the free market system or not. This is the thing we have to understand about NACs and the carbon credits, and they're coming out with they're talking about biodiversity credits and all these things, is they have not been created by market demand. They are a social agenda that is being thrust on people and told, you will think this way, you will walk this way, you will act this way, because socially they prefer that. So it's completely anti free market. The free market system is based on the concept that people are free, that people are not coerced into buying things that they don't need,
Yeah.
that people have the choice to say, no, we don't want to buy a carbon credit. Well, it's the social agenda that is creating this need for these ecosystem services and carbon credits and biodiversity credits. So it's not a free market system that's created this. And that's what the people that are making that argument need to understand, is they're actually arguing against themselves.
Mhm.
This is blackmail. And just because the blackmailers have figured out how to use the free market system to sell it to people like those who are protecting it because they think it's a free market system,
Right.
that doesn't make it right or better, and it certainly isn't a free market solution.
Absolutely. And it pushes a really binary argument that conservation or environmental protection is always opposed to any kind of profit, that there's no way of productively using land in a sustainable or regenerative way, which we all know is not true, but it really pushes that agenda um, very strongly.
Yeah, in our name it's American Stewards of Liberty, and the
Mhm.
reason it's stewards is because that's the biblical based perspective. Conservation, environmentalism, they both rely on conserving, protecting, locking down land. Stewardship is based on good management of the land for the productivity for humans and species, for human enrichment, for all of those things. And that's the biblical concept. We were told to go out, subdue the world, put a plow to work. We are supposed to mix our labor with the land. We are to make the land productive. That's what we are commanded to do in the Bible. It doesn't say, but stop once you get to 4 billion people or once you get to X number of acres. Please make sure, or I command you to make sure 30% of the land is permanently protected. It doesn't say any of that. It says, go
Right.
forth, subdue. And when you really think about it, the way that God created the earth, he's already appropriately distributed all the resources. There's some areas you can't farm. There's some
Mhm.
areas you can. There's some areas you can't graze. There's some areas you can. There's some areas you can't log or mine or drill. There's some areas that you can. That's all been already packaged for us. What people need to remember, conservation environmentalism, that is an unbiblical perspective. And if that is your founding, and why I say that is where those concepts come from is the very, very radical faction of the environmental movement, which largely believes in atheism.
Yeah.
So they believe in protecting the creation and worshiping the creation. That's why their verbiage talks about Mother Earth. That's
The-
their God. They reject the idea that there is a creator. So they are worshiping the creation over the creator. And that's the mindset behind the environmental movement and the conservation movement. And
yeah.
you know, it's so easy for us, if we're not really tuned into that, to get drawn into those arguments because nobody wants to hurt the earth. That's just human nature. Nobody's out to do that.
But
We want to protect where we live. These are just common sense principles. And so the environmental arguments really prey on that.
yeah.
And so we have to kind of guard ourselves a little bit and make sure that we understand what we are fighting for or fighting against. And so that's why stewardship is so important to us.
Yeah.
And, you know, we just over and over and over again, if you want to see well managed land, you're going to be looking at private property.
But
If you
then,
want to see poorly managed land, you're going to be looking at federally owned property or consolidated properties, which is what we're seeing happening with the consolidation of land and the food supply and all the other things. So if you really want to see good land stewardship, you will find it's in private property where you have that one individual that is there who knows his piece of land, has the ability to control, to manage that well, and is on it daily, has seen it through every season over years and years and years of time. That is always going to be your best manager of the land, always.
yeah. Oh, you touched on something so close to our hearts, and I'm so glad you did. And so, tell us a little bit more about your organization, American Stewards of Liberty, and the other issues. I know NACs and 30 by 30 are just one. What are the other issues that you are working on, and what should people be concerned about coming up on the horizon?
Yeah, so we are a property rights organization. We've been around for over 30 years. And, this is what we do. We follow these environmental issues and fight back against the agenda to erode property rights in America. So, um, watching and leading campaigns against 30 by 30 is, right in our wheelhouse, as well as natural asset companies. But there's a lot of issues that are going on, which are kind of the implementation parts of the 30 by 30 agenda. So right now, if you are in West Texas, up in the
Uh,
Panhandle area right now,
no, we're in
so
Alpine in the desert.
okay, all right,
But-
all right. Well, what I would suggest that you do is look at something called the Muleshoe National Wildlife Refuge expansion.
Okay.
Muleshoe, do you know where Muleshoe is, Texas?
No, I don't. I don't.
Okay. Well, there's a national wildlife refuge there. It's 6,440 acres. Now, in that region, all the land in Texas in that area is private property. So in Texas, 96% of the land is still owned by the people.
But,
Only 4% is owned by government, federal, state, and local. Well, there's a little tiny 6,400 acre National Wildlife Refuge outside of Muleshoe. They have just released a plan for to create an acquisition area boundary where they can go out and purchase private property to add to that refuge. Their expansion zone is 7 million acres.
Oh my goodness.
And it goes into New Mexico as well. And this has all been done without the county commissioners knowing. They were never noticed by the refuge or Fish and Wildlife Service. The most landowners had no idea this was coming. And all of a sudden, they're looking at this big circle around their property. And what the refuge has said is they want to actively acquire through fee interest or through conservation easements 700,000 acres within that 7 million acre range to expand a 6,400 acre national wildlife refuge. That's how 30 by 30 is getting implemented.
Yeah.
That's all being done administratively. It's not being done because it has no congressional approval. Congress didn't vote on this. The local counties or even the state, in the state, we didn't get a vote on this. The people who live there didn't get a vote on this. So that's how these types of agendas get going. And so it's really important to first understand what 30 by 30 is, understand the different ways it can come into your community, and then look for ways that you can fight back. And I highly recommend that you stay plugged into what we're doing. Sign up for our emails, join whatever you need to do to make sure you're getting our materials, so that we can keep you, apprised of all these different things that are going on across the country.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's absolutely. So just tell people how they can find you. What's the best way?
Sure. Go to our website at americanstewards.us. That's a great way. You can also email us at asl@americanstewards.us.
Fantastic. And do you have on the website a section where people can take actions and get involved if this is something that riles them up?
Yeah, we do. We do that through email alerts. So
Perfect.
as the issues develop, we will get an alert out to that community and help steer them into the right paths to really be effective to stop these things.
Thank you. Thank you so much for everything that you do. And thank you for coming on and talking to us about it.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We'd love to have you back. So we'll be in touch. Well, it seems like there's no end to the lengths that certain people will go for power and money. And our commitment here at Collapse Life is to keep asking those questions and bringing amazing guests like Margaret and important issues like natural asset companies to your inbox. Please help us by sharing this video widely with others. This is such an important issue. And hit the like and subscribe button on this video. You'll notice that our reach is still limited on these various video platforms. So please help us get the word out and help us so we can grow. On a positive note, our Substack has been growing amazingly. We now have over 2,000 followers, and we really hope you're one of them. And if you are, please know how incredibly grateful we are. If you like what you see, we hope you might consider buying us a coffee or upgrading to a paid subscription. And if you're not yet following us, you can find us at collapselife.substack.com. We write several stories there a week, and we post podcasts like this one every week. So be sure to check us out and subscribe today. And of course, you can also find us on Twitter at collapse_life. We're so thankful to you, our viewers, and to our guests for being here and for helping us make sense of a seemingly senseless world. We'll be back next week, and we look forward to seeing you then. And until then, keep your chin up. It's only collapse.